Hooray! We're live. Since it's just you and I, you want to give the prayer?
Yeah, I can do that. Heavenly Father, thankful for this day, thankful for we can come here as a group and that we can learn and talk about business and communications. Please bless us the spirit, and then we can always do well in our work, and that our family lives will be blessed, as well as our personal lives. These things we pray for in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. All right, so I'm just going to go through the agenda like we normally do. So what I found interesting about this case, so this case is about Columbia's final mission.
Yeah.
And before I read the agenda and before I read any of the prompts to help you understand the case, the thing that stuck out the most to me was there was an incident with a foam strike, and they didn't see fit to look into it, and they sent them off anyway, and then they perished, and that just irritates me a little bit. I found I almost found the case study too informative, like you were mentioning before we went live.
Yeah.
I don't think we needed all those
Details.
facts because a lot of it just went into issues that didn't actually affect what the case was meant to talk about. So what are the case facts? Do you want to give a couple of the facts that you came up with?
So the case facts, see, I don't have it pulled up, but basically it kind of went through like the timeline of what was happening. They were coming back to Earth, especially Columbia. They kind of lost signal with the control office, or Houston they call it, and they didn't know what was going on. Then they got a call that they crashed. So pretty much the entire case study was kind of going through why and how and the days after the crash, and what they did as an organization, how they functioned well, how they didn't function well. And I don't know if you got this, but I didn't actually see like an actual definite cause of the crash. Like I kind of had me leaning towards, obviously it was the foam, but I don't ever remember it saying like it was the foam that did it. Like they had hunches.
I didn't see that there was a definitive decision either. What I read, how I interpreted it, I should say, was that it was, to me, I took it that the whole case was about trying to learn from mistakes and how they handle crisis at NASA.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is I didn't really see it so much as Columbia's final mission. I mean, they mentioned the Challenger disaster, and they mentioned the Apollo 13 almost disaster. But I felt like the theme of the case was more leaning towards how NASA handles crisis and how they could improve it in the future. So it just unfortunately had to do with Columbia's final mission. I think one of the biggest issues, and granted, you have to consider the technical problems because legitimately they had a foam strike and they should have looked into it a little bit more and not just shuffled it under the rug, if you will. But the organization of NASA sucked.
Yeah, it did.
Like, for smart people, they're really not that intelligent.
No. The thing that bothered me was like there was one spot where it talked about like it was like some guy's ego, and he didn't want to do it just because he didn't feel like it. Like he just didn't want it.
Yeah.
I was just like, really? Like that bothered me.
It almost felt like, yeah. Well, and I was very, very surprised by the case study, to be truthful, because I've been to Cape Canaveral and I've been to Kennedy Space Center, and I've like researched NASA because I had a moment where I wanted to be a space person.
Yeah.
But what surprised me was when they have such definitive projects and such definitive goals that they did not have a chain of command when something bad happens.
Yeah.
I just think that that was probably the worst planning that I've ever seen in a company.
Yeah.
Because how many people did they have, did they say? They had like 5 different organizations
That all
participating
answer
in
to
this.
each other. And they like one can't do one without the like one a task because one won't do their thing, and then they're waiting on someone else, and then they have to like go to another organization to get approved to even talk to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, it's they weren't ready for something like that to happen.
No. And, you know, it says that at the end, use the world application, but I want to put something into perspective, at least from a Natalie standpoint now. You know, when I'm coming up with or I'm in the middle of a project, my mind, and this is just me, I don't know if this is how you think, but I think of worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And I think of the options, like what do I need to make sure I plan for the worst case scenario, what would happen, you know? And I just think that with something as huge as going to space, that should have been one of the first things they figured out.
Mm-hmm.
These people lost their lives.
Yeah. It was for me there because for example, they were talking about the foam and they kind of like disregarded it, like, and they knew it was happening before the crash, but
Mm-hmm.
they didn't look into it, and they didn't see it as important. But like, especially like you were saying, like something as big deal as this, like they need to look into the details more instead of just something that's always bothered me, especially with this case and then in business in general, is everyone's all about the deadlines over
Mm-hmm.
like other things, and they put that as first priority, and then that's what happens when you do that.
Well, I think it was our first case study. I was talking about how I believe continuous training is something that companies need to invest in.
Yeah.
And it's similar here. It's you have to put up or shut up. Like, I did not like how that lady dismissed by any means the foam strike.
Yeah.
Because I did feel like they were basically trying to pretend it didn't happen, especially when the case study said that there was enough time. There was enough time to look at it and probably fix it before Columbia took off.
Yeah.
So that was why it's important, is because people lost their lives.
Yeah.
Now, this is something, when I read the agenda, I actually didn't think of this at all while reading the case, but it says, what was the recovery window in this case? And so luckily it comes with the hints, and the hints said that the recovery window in this case was the time between when the problem of the foam strike was discovered after launch to the day the Columbia exploded.
Mm-hmm.
So they used Apollo 13, right? So they used Apollo 13, who had a crisis, and someone took charge in Houston and was able to solve it in the process of them just coming down to Earth. They were able to fix the problem. So there was quite a large recovery window because it was a multi-day exploration, and there was nothing done to try to fix it on their way back.
Yeah.
Let's see.
They talked about, I think they talked about that they could have potentially done like a spacewalk and assessed it, if I'm remembering right.
You are.
And they could have fixed it there, but they kind of just saw it as like more like, oh, like routine, that just happens with these, like, kind of don't pay attention to it, like that happens kind of thing.
Yeah, the term acceptable risk is something that comes to my mind, because when you think of acceptable risk, the company is taking on liability, and they're almost laying out the groundwork for something bad to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that, that's somewhat of an insurance type of thing. Like, you have to gamble a little bit when you're in a business, because you do have to take some risks. I don't think, at least not in my opinion, with the overview we have been, like, we learned about it, that the debris strike was acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like a foam attack during takeoff or right after takeoff should have been reason enough to explore what happened.
So one thing I didn't quite get is, like, because they explained the foam, was that just like an insulating foam on the outside, or was that like some type of sealant, or what was that?
I have no idea. I was trying to look it up, and I'm like,
Like, what are they
I don't
talking
even
about?
know. I didn't learn about bird strike until that plane went down into the Hudson River.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know that was a thing that happens to a lot of flights.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
I think that that's something very interesting, though. I mean, with as much information and background as they were giving, they could have explained what a foam strike was.
Yeah, it was kind of weird. They kind of just assumed that the reader would know what that is, and they showed
Yeah, I'm pretty
they showed a picture, but it was like still not very descriptive.
It wasn't, and because they're all black and white, there was no, like, in my mind, any help with the shading by any way.
No.
Now, they talked a little bit about human cognitive biases, and I was reading about these a little bit, and they gave us a few. So let me read what it says. It says cognitive biases, systematic errors in judgment, confirmation bias. And all of those are tendency to look for information that confirms our existing views. Sunk cost biases are our tendency to escalate commitment to a course of action into which we have already invested time, money, or other resources. So when you think about those two biases, when you're thinking about the case, I can absolutely see actually both of those things happening.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was almost like nobody wanted to look outside their box at all. They just wanted to do what they were told, and they wanted to go home at the end of the day. They weren't actively looking for ways to come up with solutions to things, even if there was nothing wrong. It just seems like NASA didn't promote ingenuity almost in that respect.
Yeah. The sunk cost bias. So cognitive is just like basically it's not thinking out of the box, and then sunk cost is you don't want to delay from your path because you've already put a lot of time and effort into it, and you don't want to restart.
And that goes back to your deadlines thing, that companies focus too much on deadlines and not on getting something done. So hold on just a second. Oh, and we just talked that. It's interesting when they were talking about the hint on this bullet point says at the flight readiness review meeting, senior NASA managers concluded that the foam shedding was an acceptable risk. Each safe return of a shuttle, despite numerous foam strikes, affirmed management's belief that there was a low risk of failure. So I feel like that's why they accepted it as a risk, because they have proof that other times it didn't damage anything and they got home safely.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like just because it's happened successfully before doesn't mean you shouldn't look into it now.
Yeah. And then as far as that goes, as far as like the bias, I don't know if you remember this, but at the very beginning, they were talking to an engineer when they were thinking when they were going to bring when they came to Earth, and he was saying that it's too cold, and they kind of ignored him, and that kind of goes back to that bias. Like, why do you have professionals and experts there to give you opinion, and like expert opinion, not just like some Joe Schmo, and then kind of disregard it? Like, I didn't like that either.
Oh my gosh, what about the part where the non-subject matter experts were voicing the opinions and making the decisions? So it goes
just off
along with
opinion
what you
instead of data.
Yeah. And it goes right along with what you just said. I mean, they're paying for these people.
A lot.
And then you have someone who counts paper clips make a decision
Yeah,
that
just
is
because they
life.
have seniority.
Yeah, it's seriously life or death. It's just, So the next one is, what is shared cognitive framing? It says that frameworks, beliefs, and assumptions that help us simplify a complicated reality. I feel like that's creating the boxes that we live in.
Yeah.
That's how I took that. And so when I think of this case, it's again, inexperienced people making decisions, people not wanting to accept other people's opinions on anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a mess.
Or do you remember the part in the study where they wanted to do an analysis on something? I think it was like on the squares that go on the outside there.
Mm-hmm.
And they used a program that wasn't meant for that, and then they sent someone to do it that didn't have any idea what they only used it twice.
Yeah.
Like the data was just that it's not going to give good data.
No, that's like putting me in charge of coding.
Yeah, like,
I can read some code, but don't put me in the computer lab with the IT guys. That will not end up well. So the next one, when did the problems with Columbia begin? So I feel like it actually began before takeoff, because even before takeoff, it didn't seem like there was any continuity to their processes to prepare for flight.
yeah. And then one thing about that too is they had Columbia. They had like a depreciation of times, and then they had like a time. They had like an expected flight count.
Mm-hmm.
So they relied on that instead of saying like, hey, you know what? We should probably look at certain things that need to be fixed instead of just saying, oh no, it's meant to last way longer. Like I don't like that attitude.
No, because we get on planes all the time. I know they're not shuttles going through the atmosphere, but they're still planes. If the mechanics behind the planes treated their aircraft like the mechanics of the shuttles.
Yeah, there we go.
Why did the debris strike become an acceptable risk? I think it really boils down to what we already talked about and what was already said in the agenda, that because they had evidence that this happening on prior flights wasn't an issue, they decided that it was an acceptable risk. I don't even remember, maybe you do, in the case study, them even commenting whether or not it was, if they gave data behind their theory, or if they were just saying, well, it hasn't happened before.
Yeah, just an opinion.
Yeah. So I think the root of the situation with the Columbia mission is complete disorganization.
For me, it goes to leadership and management.
Mm-hmm.
There's too many little branches of organization trying to figure out what to do, and it needs to be more streamlined.
No, it's true. And a lot of companies, my company does it. A lot of companies, when there's a big project, you do bring in outside contractors.
Mm-hmm.
But if your company owns it, so my company's name is Telgen. Telgen owns the project. That means that there will be a project manager or a point of contact at Telgen, no matter how many vendors are involved.
Mm-hmm.
And NASA didn't have that.
Yeah.
I feel like they threw the problems up in the air like marbles and just let them fall, and you can just pick whichever one you want to work with.
Yeah. And then because they didn't do their building, they like Boeing, and then someone else was completely in charge of all of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I don't know how well, like you just were talking about with your company, I don't know how well they communicated between the two.
Well, strictly from the case study itself, I feel like it's that simple. They didn't care. I think that that's probably their biggest weakness at NASA, is it didn't seem like there was any accountability. And it says, the last bullet point in this section is who is accountable and why. NASA's ultimately accountable,
I
It,
agree.
and I mean, think of, and I'm thinking of my venture law class right now, but there was a question on the midterm about litigation responsibility if a pizza delivery driver hit a pedestrian in a crosswalk while on work. It's the same thing. They can be held liable for that because that person was working at the time of the accident.
Uh-huh.
So NASA had their name on it. It was
Yeah.
ultimately NASA's mission. Yeah, other people should have said, hey, we're the subject matter experts. Why aren't you listening to us? But ultimately, I feel like it was NASA's issue.
Yeah. And the sad part is the people that died were just doing their job. Like they weren't, they're doing their own thing, and they paid the price for it because someone else. But like we were talking about, like who's accountable. Like if it would have been like negligence on like the pilot's part, like, but it was none of that. It was literally all management.
Mm-hmm. And that goes into group dynamics. We were reading about that in the book in our reading assignments. I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting when you think about group dynamics because for us, our group is quite simple. There's 3 of us,
Uh-huh.
and we rotate who is in charge every week. And that person is the one who documents and posts everything for the teacher. And then we talk about what time and make sure we're at the same time next week.
Uh-huh.
It's really simple, but when you get into such a granular project where they have to have so many processes done, I really think it would be solved if, like you said, management took responsibility and took control and said, hey, this is our goal. And we need someone to do this. We need someone to do this. And then gave the assignments and just check back with us.
Uh-huh. That's one of the things I wrote about in my case write-up was addressing egos and also I guess just pride in general in the management, because there's no room for that, especially in something like this where it's more data driven. There's not. I don't feel like there's a lot of wiggle room for like your opinion. Like it's engineering. Like there's
It's
not an
black
opinion.
and white.
Exactly. So
No.
that's why I don't like the fact that there's a guy in there saying, "Oh no, that's not it." Like, yeah, where's your data? Prove it. I don't know.
Oh my gosh, when you think about this in application to your own world, what is it you do during the summer? Remind me again. Are you pest or alarm?
I do pest control.
Pest control. Okay, so there's a leader, and then there's the minions, and that's what my CEO always calls us, is we're the minions. When you think about this case actually made me really uncomfortable because the scenario was just so dramatic.
Yeah.
People lost their lives because people were ego driven and prideful, and honestly, you can say that they were being lazy.
Yeah.
We know that it never happened before, so why even talk about it again? So, but that's my personal experience.
No, I agree.
All right, so I think we went over everything on the agenda. I skipped around a little just because of how conversations flow. But I think that that's everything.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have anything else. But yeah, I mean,
except we want to learn what foam strike is.
Yeah, I mean that would have been nice. I guess that's the only thing that I wish they would have talked about more, or like shown a picture of it, like been very clear in the beginning, like this is a foam strike.
Yeah.
Because I was confused. Like I was thinking like a piece of styrofoam. I was like, how could that damage? It must have been heavier because it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Like I don't know.
Because when I heard it, being in the fire protection industry, my initial thought is I know that they do have some combustibles that they have extinguisher type material on board to help limit fires. And so when I read that, my first initial reaction was, oh, it was like a hood dump at a restaurant.
Yeah.
You know, like it, but I don't think that's what it is.
Yeah. I don't. And
So,
my best guess would have been like some type of foam sealant that seals off.
mhm.
But I don't know.
Well,
'Cause,
and they talked about in the Challenger how the O-ring didn't expand to what it was supposed to do because of the temperature, like you mentioned earlier.
uh-huh.
And so maybe that was supposed to force that. That's, yeah, I'm going to have to look that up a little bit more when I have some time this weekend.
Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, because it bugs me.
I'm the same way.
Okay, good.
Cool. So I mean, if that's it, then we'll just call it quits. And then
Yeah, and I'll post
who's
it.
is Lucy next week?
Lucy would be next week, yeah.
Cool. So I guess we'll just send out an email, and then she probably knows that already, but we'll remind her.
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. Well,
Okie dokie.
I'll finish the rest of my homework. I'll see you next week.
Good luck. Good luck.
Thank you.
Bye.